Welcome, everyone. Today, we're discussing Beyond Size and AUM, the qualities of an exceptional buyer, which is the second session in our three-part series focused on acquisition success. We are excited to host this conversation today. Our team at FP Transitions has worked with thousands of practices since the firm was founded, and we work with firms across the industry with 50 million to several billion AUM. We know that each and every firm is different, and no one acquisition looks exactly alike. The fun part of working with FP Transitions is that we have a full service M&A team, a robust legal department, a valuations team, analytics team, and a staff of over 50 that provides support and service to all of our clients. Because we do it all, and we've worked in this space for so long, we are truly bringing the latest information and the best guidance to every client we serve. And we're thrilled to share our knowledge with you today. Before we get started, please note that your presenters are available for Q&A in the chat feature, and feel free to ask any questions. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you after the session has ended. And if you missed last week's session on addressing capacity and scalability for acquisition success, we've added that link as a resource on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. James Fisher. James leads FP's M&A department. James and his team completed 83 M&A deals last year and are on track to complete over 100 in 2021. During his tenure at FP, James has been integral in transforming FP into a full-service M&A firm. Marcus Hagood. Marcus has over 7 years with FP, and before that, he was with TD Ameritrade. Marcus has built a number of services and systems that support financial advisors and planners throughout their ownership journey, and he has shared his expertise at many industry events over the years. And joining us for the Q&A again this week is Scott Leek. One of FP's newest experts, Scott Leek, joined FP after his 20 years with TD, where he dedicated his time and energy to serving the RIA market. He even achieved his CFP designation in 2010 to better understand the unique challenges financial planners face today. Thank you all so much for joining us. And now I'll turn it over to James.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for the second webinar in our Acquisition Success series. Today's webinar is titled Beyond Size and AUM. This webinar is focused on really looking at the M&A process from the buyer's perspective. The presenters for today's presentation are myself, James Fisher, Marcus Hagood, who heads FP Transitions Equity Management Solutions Program, and Scott Leek, who's one of our senior consultants here at FP. As you can see from this slide, the agenda for today's webinar includes a brief overview on preparing for M&A. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on M&A prep, as we covered that topic in pretty significant detail during the first webinar that we did, but I do think it does warrant a quick refresher. The bulk of today's webinar will be spent talking about what makes an exceptional buyer, how and where to find M&A opportunities, FP's M&A process, how best to analyze a potential merger or acquisition target from a fit perspective, and then we'll conclude with a discussion of deal fatigue. We should have some time at the end for some Q&A, so I do encourage everyone to stick around for that part of the presentation. Preparing for M&A is important, and Marcus, if I could turn it over to you for a minute to give everyone a brief overview on what buyers should be doing from a preparation standpoint before they decide to even participate in the M&A marketplace.
Yeah, thank you, James. As you think about preparing your firm for M&A activities, we're following on to the conversations we had about capacity and scale in the previous presentation. And it really focuses around the concepts you see on the slide, reviewing your valuation and benchmarking reports to get a better understanding of where you're at today and an informed starting point for formulating your strategy as it relates to M&A. If you don't understand where you're at today, what your strengths and weaknesses are, what your key performance indicators are for your M&A strategy, those are all items that you need to be focused on to be successful. It's about using benchmarks to refine your strategic fit as a buyer. Assessing business foundations, that's speaking as we, again said in our last presentation around entity structure. Do you have the right staffing in place? Do you have compensation strategies in place that actually create positive outcomes for your acquisitions? Or are you potentially creating a windfall for an advisor on your staff because you're compensating them inappropriately with an eat what you kill compensation methodology? It also is about getting the key players in your team in place and making sure you have all those needed functions, the staff in place, the M&A tools in place to be successful. It's about identifying your growth goals and metrics, know why and how and what you're wanting to measure to show success. If you don't know why you're doing an acquisition or you're doing it just because, that's a recipe for disaster in M&A. It's also about determining your actionable strategy. How and why are you identifying targets? Who is the right target for you? How do you find them? How do they fit with you? Are you going to be a local, regional, or national buyer? These are all things that you need to determine in advance to prepare for your M&A activities. And then finally, leveraging professional acquisition support. That's talking about, do you have the team in place to do all the legal work, the business development staff in place to go out and actually source these opportunities? Do you have the valuation tools in place to understand what these businesses that you're potentially targeting are worth? Do you have a team to negotiate it? Or do you want to outsource to a professional firm like FP Transitions to help you with these activities? Doing all these things is how you prepare for M&A activity.
Thanks so much, Marcus. All really good points. And I think, one thing to take to heart, and I see it happen time and time again, is firms getting caught up in the M&A frenzy. There's this fear of missing out, and they're participating in M&A just to do it because that's what everyone else is doing, because that's what everybody else is doing, and that's not the right reason. As part of a firm's M&A preparation, it's really important to understand the desired M&A outcome. Is your firm seeking inorganic growth to increase your market share in the existing market? Or is your firm focused more on expanding into new markets? As an example, I've worked with many buyers in my tenure here at FPUs that kind of use a hybrid approach. And what I mean by that is they will build and increase their footprint in an existing market organically, but then use M&A in order to expand into new markets, because in their experience, it's easier to establish a presence in a new market by acquiring a well-run firm with a solid reputation, as opposed to starting in a new market de novo. While typically not the primary reasons for participating in M&A, there is a huge demand right now for qualified and capable advisors and back office support staff. So many buyers are using M&A as a way to onboard talent into their organization. We have seen buyers willing to actually pay a premium for firms that have strong teams in place, and have also seen a number of acquisitions that really wouldn't have occurred without the commitment from certain key employees to remain with the buyer post-sale. We've also seen some buyers acquire firms that had, for example, an established tax practice because the buyer was looking to deploy that service within its organization and determined it was easier to acquire a firm that already had the necessary know-how, systems, and processes in place, as opposed to building that service offering from scratch and then rolling that out to its client base. While certainly not as common as the other outcomes outlined on this slide, on occasion, we do come across a firm that is seeking to acquire or merge with an advisor or a firm for succession planning purposes. To that end, there are some young advisors out there with established books that would likely jump at the opportunity to be acquired by a larger firm, willing to provide them with a clear path to ownership because maybe they don't have that opportunity in their current firm or their current situation. I want to talk a bit now about the qualities of exceptional buyers. And given my role here at FP, I get to see the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of what works and what doesn't in M&A from a buyer's perspective. The buyers that have the most success in M&A are prepared to participate and to navigate the M&A landscape. Please do watch the first webinar in this series if you're interested in exploring more about what it means to be prepared. Marcus and did a great job going through that with Scott on what it really means to be adequately prepared before you even dip your toe in the M&A marketplace in terms of inorganic growth strategies. Successful buyers are also focused on a specific outcome or outcomes. While M&A sometimes feels like a competition that you want to win, again, don't get caught up in the frenzy or lose your focus. The most successful buyers I work with have a well-defined plan and really don't deviate from that plan, irrespective of how attractive an opportunity may look. It's also important to be patient with the M&A process and prospective M&A partners. I've worked with many firms over the years that never imagined that a transaction would take as long as it did, or that they would have to navigate the hurdles that arose during the transaction. It's important to remember that M&A is not a set it and forget it strategy. Many of the transactions have various complicators that arise through the process that will test the patience of even the most seasoned buyer. But it's important to remember from a buyer's standpoint that many sellers are selling their identity. This business that they've built is their life. These are client relationships that have become, more than just columns in a spreadsheet. These are friends. These are folks that, they have long tenured relationships with, and it can be a very emotional time for them to transition those relationships to you. So being patient is a virtue that will pay off if you are exploring growth through M&A. It's also important to be flexible. In terms of flexibility, buyers need to be flexible in getting a deal put in place with a prospective seller, while the majority of transactions do follow a similar structure. Each deal is nuanced, and buyers need to be flexible in negotiating deal terms that are fair for both parties. The market is too competitive for buyers to be rigid in their approach to deal making. Buyers also need to be flexible in terms of the M&A process itself and the hurdles that need to be navigated. The old adage, expect the unexpected, certainly holds true for M&A. And if you're not flexible in working with a seller, your chances of getting that deal to the finish line are greatly diminished. Marcus, I want to switch topics a bit again for a moment and have you talk a bit about where buyers should be looking for M&A opportunities.
Thank you, James. Sourcing M&A deals can come from a variety of places. I think the key here is that you need to diversify your efforts across a number of channels. In a marketplace where there are typically 50 to 100 buyers interested in every seller that we put on the market, it's a very competitive landscape. Knowing yourself where you fit and going out across a wide avenue of sources gives you the best opportunity to find that right fit for you. Different sources can include places like FP Transitions Open Market. You should be talking with your custodians and broker dealers and your regional reps there so that you can have conversations with those folks when they're out visiting other offices. They're likely one of the first people to know when a business is thinking about making a change. Industry trade groups, if you're a part of a study group or with your local FPAA chapter, those are great opportunities to network and build relationships with other advisory firms and owners to get a better avenue of when they're ready to make a decision. Your local network, who's in your area locally? What firms are there? What firms do you fit with? Those are all great places to find opportunities. And then finally, other institutional relationships. Again, your FPA, your NAPFA chapters, any groups where other advisors are meeting is a great opportunity and source for you to look for potential opportunities. The other thing I would bring to the table is, our open marketplace, again, is a very competitive marketplace. 50 to 100 buyers for every seller. It's hard to be the one. You need to be out there working on your strategy and identifying those targets through different sources, but also it takes a plan and having a plan in place and the resources available to be successful at sourcing those deals. If you're using FP Transition's website for your opportunities, follow the process and the guidance we provide. We're experts in this field. We do hundreds of transactions every year. We're here to help you be successful. If you haven't looked at our equity management solution services, our comprehensive transaction support services, those are all great ways to leverage an expert like FP Transitions to help you along the way. And also, don't try and circumvent the process. There is a process to how we work with firms when they're looking to acquire practices. That process is there to help make it easier on you. By circumventing it, you're making it more difficult for us to help you. Finally, I would say definitely go out and look at other sources of information on where advisors are or who advisors or what advisors are out there. Things like discovery data, other bulletin boards at your broker dealers, custodians, IARD, and Broker Check are all places where you can find additional information about what advisors are in your area, what advisors are out there, and what advisors fit best for your firm.
Hey, thank you, Marcus. One of the occasional comments I receive from prospective buyers is they don't have a lot of clarity as to our process here at FP. So I do want to spend some time today trying to provide that clarity to everyone. This is a process map from the buyer's perspective, and we break our process down into 3 phases. The first being focused on finding the ideal partner match. From a prospective buyer standpoint, this process starts by submitting an inquiry via our website on a practice that you're interested in, either after seeing the practice on our website or because you received an email from us about the opportunity. As a side note, if you have not yet signed up to receive M&A opportunity emails from FP, I encourage you to do so. Signing up is free, and it can be done from the fptransitions.com homepage by clicking on the membership tab. In terms of the inquiry message itself, I'm not going to get granular right now, but we will talk about that in more detail in a moment. After a practice has been published for a week, we start compiling the inquiries that have been received, and then we send those to the seller for review. I think it's important to note that there is no prize for being the first inquiry received by FP. So it really is important to spend some time and craft an appropriate inquiry message. But I do recommend that you submit your inquiry within a week of the practice being published so that your inquiry is in the first batch that is sent to the seller. If you happen to be an EMS member, you can contact your EMS coach if you need any assistance with the M&A process itself. If you're not an FP EMS member and would like to learn more about that, please do contact us. Of the 75 or so inquiries that we receive on each practice, the seller, with our assistance, will typically select 5 to 7 of those inquiry firms to be their potential partner and to have introductory calls with. Once those intro calls are completed, the seller will typically at that point do another cut. That cut typically is, if they selected 5 to 7, they're going to probably cut it down to 3 to 5 at that point. And those are the firms that I'll refer to as the finalists, and those are the ones that are going to get the most attention moving forward at that point. At that point, when the finalists have been selected, the seller will typically share some light due diligence with these firms and will likely want to set up a follow-up call or maybe even an in-person visit to get a little more granular in terms of the fit between the firms, the details of the transaction, and assuming it's a sell and stay type transaction, what life will look like for the seller's principal, staff, and clients post-sale. Once the follow-up calls or the in-person meetings are complete, we do request at that point that the finalist, assuming that they are still interested in acquiring the seller, present non-binding LOIs or term sheets to the seller. I use those terms synonymously. To me, they are very similar in nature, albeit some people do define an LOI or a letter of intent slightly different than a term sheet. But for purposes of this webinar, I'm going to use those terms to mean the same. So if I use one in one place and one the other, there's no confusion there. We don't at FP like or use the auction house style that some firms out there embrace when it's time to present LOIs. So we do recommend that each finalist put their best foot forward in drafting their LOI, because they may not get another opportunity to counter or amend their LOI before the seller makes their decision. Once all of the LOIs are received, the seller will, at that point, choose which of the finalist firms they most closely align with. And the alignment they're looking at, of course, is alignment with all of the seller's stakeholders. And once they have found that firm, they will countersign the LOI, and we move into phase two. From a buyer's perspective in phase two, if you haven't already done so, it is imperative that you develop a detailed plan mapping out the transaction and the integration of the seller's clients and staff into your organization. And really, we could devote an entire webinar to this topic. So we're not going to spend any more time today going through the details of what that plan should look like. But, give us a call if you have questions, and we'd be happy to get a little more granular on what we envision this plan to include. Also, if you intend to use bank financing, it is important to get that process started as soon as your LOI has been accepted. I've heard right now it can take upwards of 3 months to get financing in place for a transaction, just given the current demand. So keep that on your radar screen as soon as that LOI is in place, and make contact with whatever financing institution you want to use to assist you in terms of getting financing in place. In terms of due diligence, it's a two-way street. A lot of buyers think due diligence is really a one-way street, and their opportunity to get to open the hood, so to speak, of the seller's practice. But it's really the seller's opportunity as well to learn if you're someone they want to transition their business and their client relationships to. So I point that out just so that the buyers out there aren't surprised when they get a 3-page due diligence checklist of items that the seller would like to see from the buyer. Once the due diligence is substantially complete, the deal documents are drafted. And while I realize reviewing legal documents is painful for most clients that I work with, it is a necessary evil, and we're there to help guide you through that process as one of the steps to get you to the finish line. The other thing I wanted to point out is most of the medium to larger transactions that we are working on now do what I call a 2-stage closing, wherein the parties will sign the asset purchase agreement, and then they will seek client consent to transfer those clients' advisory agreements to the buyer, and then the transaction will effectively close once a certain level of consenting clients is achieved. Phase two is, of course, finished when the deal has closed, which includes, for most transactions, the seller receiving the agreed to closing payment. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on phase three today, albeit phase three is probably arguably one of the most important of the 3 phases, because it is really focused on transitioning and onboarding into your organization the clients from the seller and the new team members that you're acquiring and onboarding as part of this transaction. So albeit the deal is done by the time you get to phase two, you don't have a lot of time to celebrate. It really is time to focus in on the laboring work of making this transition a success. As promised earlier, I do want to spend some time now discussing the buyer inquiry message. Most sellers will first be introduced to a buyer through some form of inquiry message. At FP, it's really a fairly defined questionnaire that prospective buyers will complete, but it may be an email or it may be some other form of communication that you send to a prospective seller. But irrespective of the delivery vehicle, a lot of these traits that we will talk about here still hold true. And it's really important that potential buyers put their best foot forward and demonstrate to a seller that they are a serious and capable partner firm. Again, remember, this is likely the first communication you will have with the seller who probably knows nothing about your firm. We don't recommend that your inquiry message be a novel, but it really should be a polished message that at a minimum tells the seller about your firm with enough detail to pique their interest. Before submitting an inquiry message for a practice, it is imperative that you carefully review any information that you have and to only inquire on a practice if you are truly qualified. I will tell you time and time again, I see inquiry messages from firms that clearly did not read the marketing materials that were prepared on behalf of a seller because they haven't addressed any of the requirements that a seller is looking for. And in fact, some of them, it's a canned message that was drafted for another inquiry that they didn't actually review before they submitted. And that is very obvious when you read some of the inquiry messages that we receive. And I get, if you're inquiring on every practice that FP has for sale, it's a fairly tenuous process to update that message each time. But remember, these messages are going to be reviewed by my team here at FP and also the seller. So it is important to spend the time necessary to craft a unique message for each opportunity. In terms of the message itself, it is okay to brag a bit about your firm, but don't oversell yourself. A little bit of humility in drafting your message will go a long way. One of the quickest ways to be rejected by a seller is failing to provide complete and accurate information in your inquiry message and to include spelling and grammar errors. I have seen many potentially qualified buyers excluded from consideration because of their failure to provide accurate information and because of their clear failure to proofread their inquiry message. Again, if you're an EMS client, give your EMS coach a call if you need assistance in preparing your inquiry message.
Yeah, James, I would just add here that, it's really helpful when you're crafting your inquiry messages to think of it as your resume to this firm. Why are you the right fit? Why are you the answer to what they're looking for? Reading that bio and tear sheet that we provide can help you get insight into the firm. But most importantly, put yourself in their shoes. Really think about what is it that's in this message that they are communicating to me that they're looking for. That will really help you narrow down and refine your message.
Yeah, really, really good point, Marcus. Again, this is likely the first time that they've received a message from you and likely the first time they've ever even heard of your firm's name. So, you need to put your best foot forward. In terms of an effective inquiry message itself, this is your firm's elevator pitch. And again, not a dissertation about your firm. I would start your inquiry with a brief introduction of your firm. Then I would move into the reason for your inquiry. What was it or what is it about the seller's tear sheet or about information that you have about the seller generally that caused you to notice this opportunity and to take action to inquire? While there's no need to get too granular here, I would also let the seller know if you have any previous M&A experience. Finally, and again, I sometimes sound like a broken record, I feel like, but most importantly here is to address the specific criteria or requirements outlined by the seller in the marketing materials you have. If the seller is looking for a firm that actively manages money, you need to highlight how your firm fits the bill, so to speak. I wanted to include, in contrast, some of the, we'll call it, for lack of better terms, unsatisfactory inquiry messages that would immediately disqualify you as a potential buyer. And unfortunately, I have seen every single one of these used by a prospective buyer in inquiring on a practice. We're not going to go through each one of these point by point and point out some of their obvious flaws, but some of them are worth discussing a bit further. For example, it is fine to direct a seller to your website at the end of your inquiry message, but directing the seller to your website shouldn't be the entirety of your message. Remember, this is still very much a seller's market, and most, if not all, of the sellers I work with are not interested in moving forward with a firm that isn't willing to put a little time and effort into their first communication. One of the more frequent messages from this list that I see are buyers guaranteeing the highest multiples. Ironically, these buyers rarely state what the multiples are that they are willing to offer. And when they do, it's typically not the highest. So that in itself is another good way to get a seller disinterested in considering you as their ideal partner firm. Finally, and I said it during the last slide, but if the seller has specific criteria or must-haves in their marketing materials, such as having a CFP on staff or requiring the buyer to keep their staff post-sale, it's probably not the best idea to ask the seller in your first communication if there's flexibility there. Especially when it comes to staff. The seller isn't going to want to entertain a conversation with a potential buyer that isn't willing to retain staff members that want to be retained. That's typically a non-starter. So probably not a good idea to ask about their flexibility in your first message. Now, moving on to the introductory call with a seller, this is, in my opinion, the most important interaction you're going to have with a seller. So be prepared. It's not the first interaction. Your intro message will be the first, but this is really your opportunity to shine. And based on this call, the seller is going to determine whether you're on the short list in terms of finalist or not. So again, put your best foot forward. Most sellers tell me after they participate on an intro call with a prospective buyer that they knew within the first 5 to 10 minutes of the call whether it was a firm that they were interested in considering as their acquisition partner. So, it's important to start out, and you'll see here, with a clear and developed, polished introduction of your firm. I think that's really important. It's also really important to be prepared for this call. I can't tell you how many times I have been on a call where representatives of a prospective buyer have been woefully unprepared, and on a few occasions didn't even know why they were on this call. I get it. We all get busy, but if you're not prepared for the intro call, your chances of moving forward with the seller are slim to none. And in fact, if you don't have enough time to prepare for the intro call, my preference is you would try to reschedule it rather than moving forward and having the call, because it's not going to go well. At FP, our process for having these intro calls typically starts out with a prospective buyer providing a brief introduction of their firm, and then we turn things over to the seller to do the same. The call then progresses kind of in a general conversation about the similarities and the potential differences between the two firms, among various other topics. But given this open format, it's very obvious from a seller's perspective when buyers have done their homework and when they have not. It it also probably seems obvious, but it's really important to avoid distractions such as driving or reviewing or responding to emails during intro calls. Again, I only say these things. I'm not trying to be funny or crack a joke. I'm saying these things because I see them occur on a regular basis. So while they seem obvious, they keep happening. And I try to encourage people to ensure that they are in a place where they can avoid distractions and focus on the conversation at hand, because the seller will notice if you are distracted. While many prospective buyers do get excited about the opportunity to actually get in front of a seller, don't get too excited. And what I mean by that is don't try to control the conversation or get too far down into the weeds on a particular topic. For example, if a seller asks you about your investment philosophy, don't spend 30 minutes describing the intricacies of your model portfolios. Probably a bad idea. Another tip that might seem obvious to most, but I see fairly regularly, is a prospective buyer failing to answer one or more of the seller's question. I have on one or more of occasion had a seller mark a prospective buyer off the list, even though I thought they were probably a really good candidate, because they failed to answer a question that was asked, even if that was really unintentional. As far as deal terms, what some prospective buyers want in terms of numbers, a lot of folks want to, from a buyer standpoint, they want to jump right in and they want to focus on describing how attractive their offers are when compared to some of their competitors in the marketplace. But most sellers don't want to talk about that first. They don't want to talk about the deal terms. They want to talk about the fit and the synergies between their practice and yours. So I think it really is important to allow the conversation to develop that way. If the seller does want to talk about deal terms later in the conversation, that's fine, but I wouldn't try to lead off with that. I have an important note here at the bottom of this slide, and while it's not directly related to preparing for or participating in the intro call, it is very important that prospective buyers not attempt to contact a seller after the intro call, or frankly at any time during the courting process for that matter, without the seller's express permission. In many instances, sellers have not yet told their staff about the plan to sell their practice, and certainly don't want staff members to find out from a prospective buyer. I've seen phone calls, emails, and even gift baskets sent to a seller knock a potential buyer out as a front runner. So if you have questions about how best to communicate with a seller, and you're working through FP, contact your FP consultant, and they will help you navigate how best to get a message to the seller. The next slide, we have a list of kind of typical topics for intro calls. And while this is certainly not an exhaustive list, this slide does include some of the more common intro call topics. While understanding firm culture, investment focus, service offerings, client types, and the like are all really important topics that should be explored in an introductory call, it's also important to understand the ideal outcomes from the perspective of the principals of the firm and the employees. And I've worked on many transactions where, seller principals and employees had different time horizons, and they had really a different painting of what their perfect picture would be in their role within the new organization. A good example of that is they may have some back office employees that are looking to transition into an advisor role. So understanding their desire to not maintain status quo would be really important, because they're going to be seeking the acquiring firm. They're going to be seeking that opportunity with the acquiring firm. And if you don't have that available for them, maybe it isn't the best fit. I'm gonna take a quick break and turn things over to Marcus again to talk with us a little bit about fit. It wouldn't be an M&A presentation if we didn't spend a little time covering that topic. So, Marcus, what do you have to say about fit in a post-COVID world?
Thanks, James. Fit is, in our marketplace, akin to location in real estate. It is the primary driver of all of your communications with potential sellers. Sellers want to know that the transition of their clients, of their life's work to the buyer, is going to have the least disruption for their clients, their staff, and themselves. And that really is focused around the synergies you have with that potential seller. Knowing, what their service model looks like and their client experience looks like. What are the tangible financial outcomes they're looking for? What does the human capital look like? Fee structures. Are you billing in advance or in arrears, as an example? What does their technology look like? What are they using for financial planning software? What are you using? Are they the same? Can you make that transition? Being adaptable in reviewing all of that is vitally important. Your investment philosophy and focus is an example of another point of fit. If your focus is really on individual stock portfolios and you're talking to a seller who's using ETF models, probably not a great fit scenario. Alignment of the stakeholders. Who is on their staff? Do they have next generational owners on their staff? Have they communicated to the staff that they are thinking about selling? When does that happen? Getting alignment of all those stakeholders is vitally important for fit. Your business culture and philosophies in general, how you run the business, how you interact with the clients, all of these things are areas of fit that you want to have as much synergy with the seller as possible. Being able to communicate that effectively in your conversations with the client and in your inquiry message, those are the things that will bring you most success.
Thanks, Marcus. I want to conclude the presentation portion of today's webinar by talking a bit about deal fatigue. At some level, deal fatigue is almost impossible to avoid in a complex transaction. But if caught early and with proper guidance, deal fatigue can almost always be successfully managed. I'll tell you though, if not managed, deal fatigue is one of the quickest ways to derail any M&A transaction. And once it's derailed, it's almost impossible to get back on track. In my experience, the risk of deal fatigue will cause a major disruption in a transaction if the time between the acceptance of an LOI and the signing of the asset purchase agreement exceeds approximately 3 months. Now I'm not saying that you should jam a deal through just to avoid deal fatigue, but you do need to be cognizant of any unnecessary lags between the LOI and the signing of the APA. You have a lot of goodwill built after the signing of an LOI. Everybody's kind of jazzed because they've reached a major milestone in the M&A process, and you really want to capitalize on that. You want to keep your foot on the gas as much as possible and not lose that goodwill that you've built because of unnecessary time lags between the signing of the LOI and getting the asset purchase agreement drafted and finalized. Negotiations are certainly an important part of any M&A transaction. However, once the LOI is signed, the negotiations over the agreed to deal terms need to cease. time and time again, I've seen parties use the preparation of the legal documents as an opportunity to renegotiate deal terms. And that's not the purpose. Drafting of the legal documents isn't intended to get a second bite at the proverbial apple in terms of deal terms that have already been agreed to, and can cause a significant delay in the process and frankly, lead to significant frustration amongst the parties, which, given the delay and frustration, not a great combination and will lead to deal fatigue. Also, having a lack of a clear process or path is a common recipe for deal fatigue in a transaction. You need to put a plan in place. Make no mistake, there are a lot of moving parts to an M&A transaction, and many of those aren't known when you're developing that plan. But having a plan with reasonable deadlines for parties to meet is important, because if left to their own timelines, the buyer and seller's timelines probably aren't going to line up, and you just want to have something that everyone can look back on and say, hey, within the next 2 weeks, we're all expecting this to happen, and everybody be working towards that same goal. I do think it's important, especially in complex deals. I'm moving on to what we call the cure here. I think it's important for those types of deals, for both the buyer and the seller, to have a dedicated point person for the transaction within their organization. Now, this person doesn't necessarily need to be the ultimate decision maker, but they are tasked with kind of triaging issues that come up and tasked with keeping the deal moving forward. It's also important, again, to keep the transaction moving. That is by far the biggest cause of deal fatigue in a transaction. And as I mentioned before, having that clearly defined path is important. And it's also important to set reasonable goals. For example, a goal to complete due diligence within a week time period isn't reasonable, but it would be reasonable to set a goal of gathering 3 years of P&Ls and preparing a breakdown of AUM by client within a week time period. So I think by segmenting reasonable goals within that timeline that people can actually achieve will help alleviate deal fatigue from creeping into a transaction. Another tip that we have found very effective here at FP is to have weekly meetings between the buyer and the seller. And frankly, you should be having these weekly meetings, even if you don't think you have anything to talk about, because the purpose of this meeting is to get in front of and address any issue. And hopefully you're addressing these issues before they turn into a disruption. So I think it's really imperative that weekly meetings be scheduled. And finally, I think it's important to employ a skilled M&A facilitator like FP Transitions, because we can, in my experience, significantly improve a buyer's success rate in terms of getting the M&A opportunity to the finish line. We're also very skilled at making quick work out of any hurdles that do arise. As I said before in today's presentation, expect the unexpected is kind of a recurring theme in M&A, but with the right M&A firm by your side, the unexpected really does become easily navigable.